Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have a chance to visit with you for a little while this evening, and thank you for gathering in the service of this important work. There's a lot of luminaries in our guest audience and folks who are serious about inner work and outer change. So I'm the managing director at the Garrison Institute, and am really excited to talk about. This is one of my favorite projects that we work on and lead. And I want to give you just a second of background on the project as we open our time together. And the project, this spirituality and social change work, really began with a key question and a conviction that organizations with a contemplative practice or a spiritual foundation, a way of linking inner work to outer change, that these organizations would be more effective in their missions. And that premise has really guided us and launched a series of inquiry into this project. But it really does immediately raise further questions. Why use the word spiritual? Do you mean religious? What kind of contemplative practice? How do you measure efficacy in outer change projects? How do we recognize and identify those organizations and who's included and excluded in that work? And this rich area of work couldn't happen with just the Garrison Institute leading it, that we had to actually assemble members of the field, people who are doing the work, to help guide and shape that. This is a field building project and not a research effort that exists in isolation. So at the Garrison Institute, when we do this field building work, we believe that naming and mapping a field is a crucial first step. That's a model that we've used at the Institute for a number of years. If we can see who is doing this work as we look across the field, if we can build connections across movements, we can attract resources, strengthen connections, build collaborations, then it's like a true field of practice emerges. So workers and leaders can recognize themselves as part of that kind of coherent generative ecosystem. And that recognition is potent, especially I think when we're feeling tired or stressed or at our limits with the magnitude of the task that we have. The context really matters that this work is being done in, and there certainly seems to be a growing sense in the world that something's not quite right. Things feel fraught, uncertain. There's different descriptions, there's ways of understanding this. That uncertainty that has created a sense that solutions that are offered from urgency, which are often clever or technical fixes, are failing to address the deeper causes of the problems that we're facing. It's those solutions that are being presented. Well, we can do this, we can, AI will save us, or whatever, that we can present these solutions. But when they bypass the key principle of interdependence, they really risk reinforcing misaligned values that we have to evolve beyond. So the opposite, though, is also true, that positive values can proliferate, that positive values can be contagious. So when people are building movements or serving communities or reforming systems, when those people are connected and supported, something really greater and more exponential becomes possible. Whether we call it the great turning or a spiritual awakening or a metamorphosis, across the globe, the Garrison Institute gets to see and host organizations and people who are doing this inner work and watching and supporting how it fuels outer change. I want to share a quote. Her name is invoked often lately, and maybe not often enough. But as we are starting out this week of New York Climate Week, I've heard her name mentioned already a number of times just today. But Joanna Macy, in her quote on the Great Turning: The most remarkable feature of this historical moment on Earth is not that we are on the way to destroying the world. We've actually been on the way for quite a while. It is that we are beginning to wake up as from a millennia-long sleep to a whole new relationship to our world, to ourselves, and to each other. And that's why it's powerful that we're gathering here this evening in the presence of so many of you who are committed to this contemplation and action. To ground the work, I'm really pleased to welcome and introduce the director of our Spirituality and Social Change project, Gretchen Steidle. Gretchen has taken this guiding question, this central premise, and with her arrival at the Garrison Institute, really supercharged it. And every time we meet, and that's often, I celebrate and remark on Gretchen's good work to center the field in this work. That this is not an abstract research project that's going to live on a shelf. It is alive and it is driven and governed and advocated for and argued about by the community. So the people who are doing this work, and that is an influence of Gretchen from her philosophy of work from the very beginning. Gretchen's the author, as you heard, of Leading from Within, Conscious Social Change and Mindfulness for Social Innovation. So she sort of wrote the book on this work. She's going to walk us through a map, and you're going to get to see it live tonight, sort of debuted. She'll offer a little demo and then be joined in conversation with Radha Ruparell. Radha is a remarkable inner work leader as well, who's shaping an outer change organization through her role at Teach for All. And she's also the author of a book, Brave Now, a book that brings her insights on resilience and transformation into real focus. All of this really kind of points back to that central truth that our work hinges on recognizing our interdependent selves and our existence that is dependent on each other and interconnected. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the air we share every time we take a breath. This is rich, abundant, and amazing mixture of a shared space between us that often moves in and out of one another. So in the spirit of that, Gretchen, would you mind to start us off with a brief practice and then take it away and tell us about the map and the project?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who are joining us this evening. I'll invite us all, if it feels comfortable to do so, to lower our gaze or close our eyes and begin to take notice of our breathing without a need to change anything. We just allow our attention to rest gently on the ways that we breathe in and breathe out. You may notice your pace of breathing shifting, lengthening, slowing as you bring awareness to it. Notice where you may pause in your breathing. And notice that exquisite point where the in-breath becomes the out-breath and the out-breath becomes the in-breath. And now allow your awareness to move from your own breathing outward beyond the edges of your body into the space that you inhabit. Becoming aware of the circle that we form through our participation today and the many others that are connected through our many ways of relating and being and connecting. And with one final deep and cleansing breath, I invite you to open your eyes and return to our gathering. Thank you. So I am truly excited to be able to be here to share with you what we have been up to at the Garrison Institute with the Spirituality and Social Change program. Our purpose is to make visible, to learn from, to help catalyze a generative field at this intersection of contemplative practice, spirituality, and inner work with social change. I've had the privilege over many years of working with practitioners in many parts of the world that were finding that bringing in the contemplative, the reflective, or the inner work was really essential and critical to the ways in which they were developing their programs and having impact within their fields. But it wasn't necessarily the case that they recognized they were part of something bigger than themselves, that an organization that might be working in schools and another working in prisons and another on climate change had this common thread, but didn't naturally connect with each other through the work that they were doing. And yet there is this incredible movement that is strong and growing. And we are privileged to have this opportunity to try to bring us together and to bring greater visibility and thus amplify the work and the impact that I hope we can achieve together. Um, this effort has begun from the very first moments of its design and establishing the contemplative values that would guide it with the support of many other practitioners. So this is truly a field-led, field-driven endeavor around what do we want to know? How do we want to learn from each other, and how could this serve the field? And so what you're seeing right now, what I'm about to show you, is the first glimpse at this early stage map, but it's more than a map. We call it the Conscious Change Collective. It is a community, and I want to show you how it is, in fact, growing. So you can find your way to this Conscious Change Collective through the Garrison Institute's page for the Spirituality and Social Change Initiative. And by clicking, this tells you a lot about the program, but clicking here on map will bring you through to our website that provides a little more in-depth guidance about who we are and what we're doing and how to use this map. And then through here, you have a chance to see the map itself. I want to jump in with a closer look at this map and give you a little test drive of what exists here. And then we're going to have a chance to hear from one of our senior advisors and a participant in this map, what this field might mean for them, and to have that discussion with all of you as well. So here is the Conscious Change Initiative. I'm sorry, the Conscious Change Collective. In map form, we are using Kumu as a data visualization app. And when you open it up, you have here on the left side a panel that gives you a little bit of an explanation of different ways you can work with the map. You can close that very easily here and center what you're doing by just dragging and moving around this map. Now, what you'll see in here right now represents almost 260 organizations that have been invited into this map so far through our research of over 500 organizations. And we have another 150 that have been referred that we're working through. And so this is growing really, really quickly. Within this map, each of these little nodes represents an organization that has completed an in-depth profiles survey that is given information all about what their programs are, the contemplative practices that they use, the core values that underlie their work, their theory of change, how they understand the inner work to be contributing to their organization's efficacy and impact. And so on. And so this richness of every profile is here for you to take a closer look. But in aggregate, it represents a data set of this entire field as we have a chance to populate this map that we can also study. There's ways to use this map to get a filter on who is doing what within this organization, including the social issues that they're working on. For example, you here can click on the organizations that have selected very specific areas of work, climate action, sustainable, resilient energy, human rights, peace and justice. You start to see the map growing as organizations have selected what it is that they are working on. You also have a chance to search by the community that is served. For example, which organizations are working with children, youth, young adults, and so on. You have a chance to explore different communities that are being served through this work. You also have a chance to search by inner work modality if you're interested in those that are using just meditation and mindfulness practices or nature-based practices or contemplative arts, for example. The map will shift and change to let you have a chance to see who those organizations are. And we also have a chance to look at how they're investing in inner work and why, the geographical location of what they're doing, and the different roles that they play within this larger ecosystem as capacity builders, as practitioners, as research organizations, for example. You can also kind of isolate an organization and get a sense of who they are and how they're connected within the map. Here we have all of these different lines represent relationships, and we can look within the map at how organizations are collaborating and learning together. We can also look at funding relationships, which we also hope will grow as we have a chance to invite funding organizations into the map, and networks of networks. And this will be able to be seen over time as it grows and to see the interconnections within organizations. You also have a chance to isolate an organization and look at the ways in which it's connected. Here's the Garrison Institute. Arrows going towards an organization and back to it involve how organizations have identified each other in these collaborative ways. And then finally, through these different viewpoints, you can also get a sense of a geographical map of where these organizations are located throughout the world and where we have hubs, for example, of organizations that are working with inner work for social change right now. There's a large network within the Mid-Atlantic to New England area and on the West Coast, but increasingly we are building out, and we hope to continue to do so, a global network of these organizations. And so with this, we also have the opportunity to output a huge database to be able to study that information and to look at relationships of betweenness and centers and hubs and who's most connected within this. We can also use this to help us identify gaps of who's missing so that we can continue to work to ensure this is as inclusive as possible. What we are doing right now as a community is deeper sense making together. We've invited all of the participants in the map to pose specific questions, to explore different ways in which we can sense make across the map. So perhaps we have a chance to look at how one modality is being used across the world to gain insights on ways that yoga or mindfulness is being applied for social innovation. We have opportunities to look within a particular geographical area, like a city, to explore all the different organizations using contemplative practice within that particular location and how together they might sense make around the needs and the opportunities to work collaboratively in that one location. or bigger, deeper questions about what is emerging within the field, what do we find most alive for us right now and most challenging, and how might we be able to support each other through the needs and the obstacles that we have so that we can take collective action or provide support for each other like a true mycelial network, and deepen this ecosystem for the sake of our collective impact. We wanted this finally to be not just a one-time snapshot of who's who doing what within the world, but a live, dynamic, and evolving dynamic community. And so that is why we're calling this a collective, and why it has been from the very beginning field driven and field organized and designed. And we hope that over time, the collaborations that are sparked from the learning that we're doing and surfacing the wisdom within the field and the growth of this network will prove to serve as a generative field, and that this itself will determine where we go next as a community. And so to have a chance to share more from one of our senior advisors who's been part of the development of this collective from the very beginning, and who also represents an extraordinary wealth of wisdom around field building and systems change. I want to invite Radha Ruparell into the conversation. Radha is a global cross-sector expert in personal transformation and collective leadership. She's heading the Global Leadership Accelerator for Teach for All, which is a growing movement spanning more than 60 countries and tens of thousands of locally rooted, globally informed leaders committed to ensuring that all children can fulfill their potential. She's also serving as the Chief Learning Officer for the Global Institute for Shaping a Better Future, where she's also focused on inner leadership and systems-wide change. And now she's serving as one of our senior advisors for the Conscious Change Collective. So welcome, Radha. And
Hey, Gretchen.
wondering if you could start by just telling us about your role at Teach for All and how you are building a movement of educational leaders for systems change.
Yeah, sure. So I always love being with you, Gretchen, because you are one of the systems builders that I respect and admire the most. But for those of you who don't know, let me just share what Teach for All is. So we are a global network of organizations now in 60 countries around the world. And in each of these countries, what we do is recruit young people to go teach for 2 years in high needs communities. And 80% of them who thought they might have spent 2 years of their life doing this end up staying for a lifetime in the work. So some as teachers, others as school leaders, in Afghanistan working on girls' rights, some working in health because, kids are not getting fed, some becoming social entrepreneurs. And, ultimately the idea is that these leaders, alongside many others in these local communities, can take on system change together. And our core belief is that to transform systems, we need collective leadership. So we do need students and teachers and parents and companies and social entrepreneurs coming together to think about how do we reshape education so we can actually have young people shape a better future for themselves and for all of us. And so that's kind of the core of our work. And my role there is, what I've come to believe is, well, we can't change systems out there without doing the inner work in here. So for the last decade, I've been building this Global Leadership Accelerator, which is all about building the inner capacities for outer change.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what those inner capacities are, how you're fostering them, and how is that actually driving the systems and changing collective leadership that you speak of?
Yeah, ultimately, it is really so much of what I think the people on this call, may know, but it's around how do we know ourselves deeply? How do we pause and center on what really matters? How do we be in relationship with one another? In order to be able to work with one another, how do we pause and see the bigger system, see our deep interconnectedness? And we also think about, as we do that, how do we together co-create? shared purpose and disrupt injustice and operate with a sense of possibility. And, just to bring one of those to life, I've really been focused a lot on this work around the relational work and how that starts with this deep, deep, deep inner work. We're often operating in contexts where there is such deep trauma. I'll just give one example. I was in one country recently that's just undergone a massive, massive genocide. And it's quite recent history. And so we've been working with the team there to think about, well, how do we develop the inner capacities to digest that, to heal ourselves, to not see that as our individual responsibility, but as our collective responsibility. And if we can build cultures that are not about trauma, but that heal as you go, all of a sudden that transforms the energy we're putting in the systems outside us. Because I think my biggest belief is if we want a world that is compassionate, where young people are collaborating, where there's justice, we have to start by embodying these capacities ourselves.
And within these communities, how open and receptive are people to beginning to step into this space of inner work?
Yeah, what's amazing is, well, at least in our network, we have now built it into our core mission that our work is around growing leadership capacity. And, 5 years ago, we said it's growing collective leadership. But I will tell you, the journey wasn't easy. I think, growing up, just a little bit about me personally, I grew up in Canada, to parents who were born in Africa, to grandparents who grew up in India. On one side of my family, there was business entrepreneurs. On the other side, there was educators. So I think I've always been bridging different worlds, the spiritual and the rational, East and West. I've worked across sectors from, business to health to education transformation. And so I think deep in my DNA, I've always had sort of this within me. But when I started this journey 10 years ago, I will tell you, it was me and four people in a forest outside of London. And I was kind of doing this on the down low in my organization, this deeper inner work, because people said, well, that's not really meant for the workplace. And then slowly I brought together a few leaders and they started telling other people, and not just telling, right? Some people said, well, something looks different in you. What's happening over there? And over time, you start building conviction that, yeah, there isn't this separation between personal and professional. And I think the beauty of working in a global network is, I've led work in New Zealand where we then, look at the Maori traditions, or in the Himalayas in Nepal, where we've been able to bring in a Buddhist monk. And because the local leaders are bringing their own culture and wisdom, and we're grounded in data and science as well, I think there has been receptivity. But yeah, it was probably a 10-year journey between these four people in a forest to now we've actually institutionalized it. So I have a big team that focuses on this. We've just launched this new global institute for shaping a better future, where this inner leadership is a core pillar of trying to reshape education globally. And so, yeah, for anyone who's early in the journey, just know that it's possible. It takes some creativity. And that's why I love that we're building a community around this.
I think your experience resonates so much with many other organizations that I've spoken to in this field, where there's this like deep inner instinct or a theory of change as to why this matters, and an opportunity to pilot and experiment, and to especially, I really appreciate the ways in which you are blending the evidence basis, the scientific piece, with the local lived experience and wisdom and cultural context to adapt and bring forth where these come together to be of greatest service. And it's not always front and center in the ways that we communicate about our work, but yet as we discover how essential it is, there's this need to be able to share the wisdom that's coming from this work. And I think, and I'm curious how you've discovered this as you're mobilizing and organizing and growth of your movement has evolved, that it's easier knowing that you're not alone in this work, that as this becomes more mainstreamed, more In fact, we have one question asking about your relationship to the inner development goals, other movements that have helped us legitimize the importance of inner development. It becomes easier to be able to make this more front and center around our core purpose and how we do our work. I'm wondering if you can comment on what a movement like the Conscious Change Collective that we're doing here through the Garrison Institute might be of service to, how it might be of service to organizations like yours if it were around at the earliest stages.
Yeah, and I'm glad that there's the inner development goals. There was, Gretchen and I met through this initiative called the Wellbeing Project. And I have to say, I'd say a decade ago, there wasn't really as much of a movement about this. I did feel quite alone sort of in the field. I don't know, Gretchen, if you did as well. There was pockets, right? But it was very, very niche. I do think there was an era during COVID, which, had massive impacts on many people. But one thing that came out of it, I know at least for me, I saw was that there was a growing understanding that actually thinking about things like our well-being, taking a moment to pause in this world that's always been crazy, the way you saw people connect across borders to make things happen. Vaccines, I used to work in global health, got built in record time because there was a recognition that we've got to pause and slow down and actually see our interconnectedness. And so I do think this, Gretchen, we couldn't have done this 10 years ago. I don't even know if you've been able to find the 200 organizations, but how do I see this being helpful? In so many ways. One is just knowing that we're not alone. Like I remember, Gretchen, when I met you and I'm trying to build something, knowing that there's people out like you out there. The second is this opportunity for shared learning. Some of the questions we get is, well, how do you communicate about this to people who don't know how to do it? I've learned a lot on this. When I'm with some of my European colleagues, I talk in terms of the neuroscience, and then slowly I integrate practices from my own culture. When I'm in places in Asia, sometimes I actually start with the contemplative practice because it's actually so inherent in some cultures. I think there's other questions around, well, how do we measure this and do it in a way that's, that is honoring the fact that actually everything shouldn't be measured in the same way that we've learned, but that there are very creative ways. I can show you some of the things that we've tried, and questions around, well, how do we grow this so it's not just for a small set of people, go beyond niche, but how do we scale with depth? I don't even like that word scale. I also think about just how do we grow this movement with that same depth? And so these are the types of questions that we can do together. So I think knowing you're not alone, shared learning. And the last thing is, I do hope that collectively, as we get together, we can start shaping the field. How do we generate funding for this? How do we change the narrative in the world that says actually success is defined by extrinsic factors? Like, what if we all came together and talked about this together in our various fields? So I just think there's a lot of opportunity. I'm really, really excited to know others in the field.
Absolutely. Thank you. I agree. When my organization, Global Grassroots, was at the earliest stages bringing mindfulness and mind-body trauma healing to women survivors of war working on water infrastructure, it seemed like it didn't relate at all to what we were trying to do in terms of systems change. And yet we found that the essence of being able to develop that sense of compassion by understanding change from the inside out actually seemed to influence the relationships that people built and thus the ways they solved problems and the sustainability of their projects long term. But we didn't know how to talk about it either, and we weren't sure how to measure it. And it took a lot of reaching out and through the connections and networks that connected us to discover, oh, there are others doing this too. And we have a chance to learn from each other and celebrate and draw out the wisdom from this kind of work that might encourage others to do the same. So Teach for All is certainly a global movement with a depth of experience and breadth in what you've been learning about collective leadership, movements towards systems change. And the collective, the Conscious Change Collective is still at its early stage. So I guess last question for you is, what are any biggest lessons or insights from the work that you have been doing that could guide this movement as it's in its
Mm.
early stages?
Hmm. And lessons around the inner work, or lessons around kind of building a movement, or
Yeah,
any of the
I
above?
think both. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, a few things is stay the course. I
Mhm.
remember there was moments where you said, is anyone really going to get this? And I think, by virtue of the fact that you all are here, you might have been some of the early adopters. And so there will sort of be ups and downs. And just remember the power of community. So that's one. I think it's lean in, right? I
Mm.
think about these are the times where we need it more than ever. It's I live in New York. It is the UN General Assembly week, and I hear so much talk about things like polarization, meta crises, all of these like buzzwords. And ultimately, for me, it actually is quite simple. Again, if we can pause and slow down and learn to be with one another and learn to see ourselves as interconnected, so much, we actually get to the deeper roots of these challenges. And I think the last thing I'm learning is stop seeing the inner work as individual work. So I think, so I grew up in it's, East West, right? So I grew up in an Indian upbringing where it's all about community. And I've watched mindfulness and other practices take form in the West. And by the way, I think there's such beauty in both, right? I feel like many of the practitioners who brought it to the West have actually allowed it to be understood in a very different way, simplified in a way that it makes it accessible in our lives. And yet, so many of the Eastern wisdom traditions bring this idea of community. So I've just come to believe that when we think about the inner work as collective work, when we actually do this together. So I do a lot of work with called deep performing teams, where it's not just building the capacity in one person, but how do we grow it in a culture? I personally believe we're going to have these little pockets of light where enough people are operating in a different way that something radically is going to transform. So that's the other thing I would say is, if you have opportunities, let's get out of this very individualistic way of thinking about this work and actually start trialing it in pockets, because we don't have to do this work alone. We really can source one another. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's powerful and an important invitation. And so I wanted to ask all of you who are here, if you feel inclined to share in the chat, what's exciting you about this collective and how a generative field could serve you. And Steve's wondering how people are talking about this intersection. There's a lot of different language that's been used: inner work for outer change, um, deep transformation, um, contemplative action, social innovation, spiritual innovation. So curious about what resonates for you and what we're talking about. While you are considering how you might respond to those questions, one question in the Q&A that I want to speak to is, if you are doing work where these two inner and outer dimensions intersect and you would be interested in joining the collective, please reach out to us on the Conscious Change Collective website. There is a link for referring organizations, for applying to be part of the collective. And it really is just about, if you feel like you align with our values and you are working at this space, like, our collective is eager to have you represented in the map, because um, we really are trying to identify a broad community of organizations that are doing this in many different ways at this intersection. And so please do reach out. I have to say, it's one of the most joyful aspects of my role, is how many incredible organizations I get to speak with and learn about, and the incredible work that you're doing out there. Are there any questions from our community? I think we can hand it over to all of you. Things you're wondering about with respect to Teach for All's work, the Spirituality and Social Change Program, or the Conscious Change Collective and its map in particular.
Gretchen, you can see Valerie's question, so you may want to dig into that in a moment, but I thought I would just take the opportunity to thank Radha and you both for really your leadership on this work. Do you have early insights into what the map is telling us? And as you've already hinted a little bit in your conversation, how we might use this. So if you were a Teach for All in its nascent stages years ago, and you had this map, like what are we seeing now in it with the modalities and the populations that are being served? Are there gaps or questions that are popping up for you?
We are just in the early stages of looking at that. We have a really beautiful mix right now of organizations that are representing a wide range of faiths, as well as I think nearly a third or to a half of the organizations are spiritual, but secular organizations. We have a great variety of organizations represented in terms of size. From the majority of our groups are less than 10 individuals within the organization themselves and their leadership. So a lot of grassroots groups around the world. We're predominantly based in the US at this time, but we are eager to grow our understanding of the global network of organizations. And we are certainly acknowledging that this is just a start, that there are many, many groups that are not yet visible, that we hope we can help bring greater visibility to. The majority of the organizations are utilizing mindfulness meditation practices as their primary inner work modality, and we're eager to draw in more somatic-based organizations, those using arts and other forms of inner work practices. We do have a strong representation of Indigenous organizations within the network, and so, we continue to explore which pockets are not represented and how can we continue to invite in, and we ask within the collective and with all of you for your support in helping bring to our attention those organizations that we don't yet know about.
Yeah, thank you, Gretchen. I'm gonna move us along in a couple of other questions. So we've got them both in chat and Q&A. So I'll ask you to move your questions into Q&A, but I'll start with these in chat. And Radha, would you be willing to take this on? How does inner work change the assessments and the policy solutions? This is Valerie's question.
Yeah, and I can maybe take a bit of both of them because they're related. This is something that's really on my mind. So when we've launched this Global Institute for shaping a better future, we've got policy wonks in there, and we've got measurement experts, and then we've got folks who are doing the deep work. Let me give you one example. So there is a group of schools in Vietnam, and it's kind of what's called a happy school movement. And what they started doing was mindfulness and contemplative practices in schools. And what they discovered was there was actually quite a bit of resistance early on, because it is in some ways cultural, but there was also countercultural. Like even some teachers would say to the other teacher, "What are you all doing?" So one of the things that they discovered, which I just think is so powerful, and maybe this is one of my big lessons learned, is like bring everyone into the work. And so they started identifying parents and community members and actually bringing them in. They started working with school leaders, but they also started identifying people in the government. And again, at the beginning, you think you got to go talk to them and, to get into policy, flash the report. But ultimately, the best way to have people understand the inner work is bring people into the work. Bring people into the work. And I've done that too. I've had potential supporters or funders, and instead of sending them a report, I say, come alongside us in the Himalayas and Nepal. And it's risky, right? Uh, but that's, ultimately people want human connection. And so what I've found is that when we can actually bring people in, then starting to shift policy. So in Vietnam, like they actually have started to shift policy at the national level around education and what outcomes are tracked there and what incentives there are. And they're now trying to do that at the global level with these global tests that are very academic, but now they're saying, well, we need to consider these other capacities. So I think that's what I've learned is actually bring folks alongside you in this work. And that's how things can shift, again, another way from the inside out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Radha. Max asks an interesting question specifically for Teach for All, but about how myth is used in inner work. And I wonder, Gretchen, if you could start with that. Do we have any organizations on the map that are using myth or talking about those tools?
It would be, I would not be surprised if that were the case. At this time, the folks that first come to mind are an organization called Commonplace that are just emerging, founded by a group that's coming out of the Global Compassion Coalition. And they are, through storytelling and exploring identity, looking at the underlying assumptions that exist within systems and how, as we perceive of those and our obstacles to systems, might we imagine and reimagine new narratives that can support how we shift perceptions and change within systems. And so I can't identify others precisely at this moment, but that is the kind of question that can easily be explored through the map by looking across organizations at the ways in which they describe their programs, their theory of change, and how they understand their kinds of modalities to work towards creating social change.
Yeah, I want to add, Max, while I don't know of any organization that is explicitly doing that, we're going to see how the map shapes up. I am familiar with a number of teachers and folks who are integrating myth and work in their teaching. So if you're curious or you want to talk about that, let me know. Another question. Are there plans to include individual researchers or research collectives working at the intersection of spirituality, contemplative practice, and social change in the map? So looking at organizations and collectives on the research side, Gretchen.
I think it would be amazing if we can do that. At this moment, the map is built to identify organizations. And so we do have some academic institutions or centers within academic institutions that are focused at this intersection already represented in the map. We do hope that the map can be of service to researchers who may want to use its data to look at patterns and pose deeper research questions across this field. And I think as we develop the technical capacity to represent individuals, that includes individual leaders within social change movements who have their own body of work but aren't necessarily represented by organizations and perhaps individual researchers, I think that would be of great value to this field.
Great. Radha, could you go back to this discussion about translating impact beyond the language experience of contemplative practitioners? Troy has an interesting question about how we measure impact.
So I can tell you, we're just putting a lot of creativity in trying many different ways. I don't know. Steve, can I share my screen? Maybe I'll show you one example of something that we did and something we're trying. So one thing, let me just see. Give me a moment. You know how, however many times you share your Zoom screen, it's all I do every day. It always takes me a minute. So give me a moment. Let me give you one example. All right. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay. So this is an example. I brought together 20 senior leaders, so CEOs of organizations that are reimagining education around the world. So they're running organizations, and I brought them together because I said there's a multiplier effect. If these folks, whether it's in Cambodia or Mexico or Nepal, can come together and learn from one another, then they can bring this into their system. So this was based, using neuroscience, contemplative practice. I co-facilitated with this with a Maori facilitator from New Zealand. We did nature-based inquiry. It was just a year-long journey with time in person, virtually. And so one of the things we said is, well, how are we going to know if we're making a difference? And so we just got really creative. So we actually did one-to-one interviews with all the 20 leaders when they started. And we said, like, what do you want to see shift? Where are you now? And what do you want to see shift? And that got to these three big shifts: from stress to centered, disconnected to connected, reactive to generative, right? So even look at the disconnected to connected, right? From seeing separation to seeing our interconnectedness, from leading with ego, fear, and shame to being led by love and compassion. And actually, ultimately, what we did is we ended up identifying some sub shifts, but that came from the participants' own words. And I just thought that was fascinating. Like if you look at the second one under stress to centered, more than one of these like social entrepreneurs said from seeing rest as lazy to seeing it as important, right? From everything feels hard to things flow with ease. And so we actually started seeing this in their own words, which I think also is helpful because I think language matters. And when they're seeing this, and then over the course of the fellowship, we did a lot of lean data. So every time we got the group together, at the end of it, even if it was an hour-long session, we'd put up a Google Doc and we'd say, what's something that's shifting in you and what's a question that you have? So we could actually map people's journeys. But we looked at these 15 indicators before and after. And what was fascinating is we just saw shifts on all 15 dimensions. And usually I see people going downwards. But what we also were able to do was we were able to give people personalized data dashboards. So it wasn't just around measuring and getting others to see what's been shifting. It also started giving people a sense that they had made sort of progress. And then the last thing we did is, we also, let's see if I have it in here. We also spent again, a lot of time capturing videos. And I'll give you an example, right? This is the first woman on here, from some of her video testimonials. She shared things like she's the CEO of Teach for Bangladesh. And she started to just share how this is having an impact on the system around her, right? She said, we're constantly putting a burden on our children. You have to be perfect, make more money, be successful in the societal framework. We have to come out from those notions. The shift in me is not being perfect. And I was deeply moved by this notion that perfection is a violence, right? But then what she was able to do was take that idea into school systems and say, look, how do we think about tests and expecting perfection of kids? And what would it look like to think more holistically around how do we think about measurements for kids? And, ultimately it's, I'll just stop sharing, but ultimately then it's a long game now to capture stories of what's shifting. But what's incredible is we now have these journeys of these individual leaders. We're now starting to work with whole teams. So I do hope we can start having these 5-year pictures as well that includes qualitative, but also quantitative data that includes, wow, we have an individual leader shift week by week for a few months. And then 5 years later, we start seeing what's happening in Bangladesh differently or Cambodia differently. And so I don't know, I'm just playing around with different things to be creative. I'm sure there's a lot of wisdom in this room as well that we could tap into. So again, but I think this is a beautiful thing about this map. We don't have to think about these things alone. Everything of ours is open source. I've learned so many from others, and yeah, I hope we can continue learning together.
Amazing and wonderful work. And thank you so much for being ready with that material too. That's a great example. As we move toward our close, we've enjoyed this hour. This has been important, and we hope plants some seeds that grow with you and maybe between us and among us. Gretchen, what is next for the map, and how can we be in touch if we want to share more or be added to the map or follow the progress?
Thank you. And in speaking to what's next, it does address the last question that we have there about compromise and ensuring that we're upholding spiritual justice, socio-political imperatives, and community trust and equity. This week, our community of participants in the map and advisors are coming together for some really deep sense making around critical questions like these. What are the practices that allow us to expand our capacity for discomfort, to develop new ways of being, relating, and doing? How do we build spiritual resilience without falling vulnerable to spiritual bypass? How are we accountable together? How do we work through any of our own blind spots that might perpetuate logics of oppression? And what are we seeing and sensing in the field, and what is emerging from this field, so that we can be embodying and living out our values, and we can be distilling the wisdom from this field as it grows. So those sense-making conversations are taking place this week, and we are eager to be sharing what we're learning from this field together over the coming weeks. We will be leading into next spring an in-person convening at the Garrison Institute, where we hope to invite all of you to join us to celebrate this generative field unfolding, the wisdom, the insights, the research, and the models of this work from around the world. So we're looking forward to more sharing and a chance to come together.
Thank you again, and thank you everyone for your presence and your leadership in this work, Gretchen and Radha. Thank you all. Have a good evening.